Jinak to je úplně stejně.
Jo, je to úplně stejně. Jo, akorát ten přijímač je tam v knihovně.
Jo, a to mají zapít. Jak to tenhle?
To teď jdu zapnout, ale každopádně jenom ty si fakt nemá zvlášť.
No sitting.
Pavlo, máš to tam?
Okay, so welcome everybody. Another big event we are hosting in Seattle. Timely prepared for this election night in the United States. This is the main subject, elections in the United States of America. And we are very lucky to bring some, I would say already, friends who are not here for the first time, but also some new acquisition, I would say, to the several community. We have one American, Jeremy Shapiro. We have one British, named He was already yesterday here to talk to you about the British prospect, and our favorite guest, Bruno Macieś, who is the Portuguese, so representing Europe. And the guy who is going to moderate with me is Jan Ružička, a long-time friend of mine, who works for PPF in Hong Kong, and is also behind establishing the publishing house, which already printed the second book by Bruno, this time on the United States, the first one in Czech translation on the geopolitics of coronavirus, we already purchased earlier when he was here. This time the book which was released a couple of years ago, is about the United States, and they became big friends in the meantime. So, just my privilege is now to ask Honza to introduce our dear guests.
Yeah, we are really very happy that we can be here together at Several tonight. So first and foremost, we should thank our host, Katarina, who is leader of Consulting Center of Several, and also a good friend, and we hope that we will in the future do even more events. And not only with Bruno, but our new acquisitions, and not only as lecturers, but we hope that, for example, Matt Goodwin's book that we will be privileged to translate into the Czech language as well. I make it short. We have three great speakers here, super knowledgeable. We have American view on America, we have a Portuguese, we have a voice from London. So all three of them are best-selling authors. They frequently speak at Bloomberg, CNBC, FT, you name it. All of them, and this is, I think, great for us. They are not only like theorists or bookworms, writers, and academicians, but all three of them have some real impactful experience in practical policy making. Bruno used to be Minister for Europe in the Portuguese government. He also worked at the council. Jeremy Shapiro was an advisor to the State Department, and also not only in Washington, but also he was an advisor to General Stanley McChrystal in NATO. And Matt Goodwin is working in and off in British administration and as an external advisor as well, which I think is good because present politics, especially in the middle of election night, it's good to have someone who were part of it, not only as outsiders or analysts, but really part of policy. So really great to have you here. We have a book you can buy there. Bruno will be definitely happy to sign it for you. It's a second book that we published together in collaboration. It's a longer book than the American original by 50 pages because we wanted to not only to write about Trump but also to have it as recent as possible. So there are 50 more pages about Joe Biden, and we actually finished the book in the middle of September. So it's really good. So without further hesitation, Sasha, first question.
We as agreed with sponsor not to give them the chance to say their every blah blah blah, but to go straight into debate. So the elections are going on today. It's the midterm election in the House, one quarter. In one third of the Senate and the majority of the governors, and there's a 6 hours difference, or 7 maybe, I don't know exactly, 6. We don't know, still going on, but tomorrow we will wake up and we will get the results. So the first question is the dangerous one, and this is, what is your bet? How of the result of those elections? So I know it's not easy for you because you will be checked tomorrow morning, but please try to make your best estimate about the result. I don't know, Bruno first.
Well, I think most people are now expecting a Republican victory, certainly in the House and probably in the Senate. I wouldn't expect the Senate to 149% for the Republicans. I'll be cautious there. I don't think will be a blowout. Now, the other set of predictions, not so much about the results, but about what comes after. Very quickly, see Joe Biden very weakened after this. Democrats in a bit of a commotion, how to react to it, shock. Obviously, the way this has been framed as the election to decide the future of democracy in America, even today, that's the mainstream comments coming from the Democratic side. It's very difficult to see how you react to the defeat, but you have framed it as thinking about the survival of American democracy. Either you have to take it back tomorrow, or then obviously the debate is going to become very, very heated very quickly. And then Trump will announce his candidacy, and then Trump will be back on Twitter. And I think 2 weeks from now, things could be pretty intense. I'm more interested in making those sort of predictions seem to be safer and also more consequential than exactly determining whether it's 51 or 52 or 53 for the Republican Party. But I'll defer to my two panelists here about the
Well, firstly, good evening to everybody. If you look at the election forecast and polls, the Republicans have an 80% chance of taking control of the House, and they have around now a 57% chance of taking control of the Senate. But as I said to a host this morning on Bloomberg, election forecasts are a little bit like sausages, and that once you've seen how they're made, you generally don't want to go near them. Maybe that's a joke for England, not the technical I've been near too many election forecasts to take them as seriously as some of my colleagues, but I think my gut instinct is that the Republicans will take the House and the Senate. I think the red wave will be deeper and wider than we anticipated. I think it's worth remembering that historically the opinion polls over the last 12 years have understated the strength of the Republican vote. And I think we also need to remember the politics of inflation. There's a temptation to view what's happening in America at the moment simply through the lens of American politics, but actually if you look at every election that's been held since the rise of inflation, the dominant story has been incumbents being very seriously punished by voters. Brazil, France, Italy, Sweden, to some extent you can point to South Korea, countries further afield, but the general story has been an anti-incumbency story. So perhaps tomorrow, if we do wake up and the Republicans are on their way to controlling both the House and the Senate, maybe actually that's just a story of America becoming like every other country in the context of this current crisis.
Well, I really like the sausages. But other than that, I think I mostly agree with my colleagues. It's incredibly stupid to predict a U.S. election. So thank you for that question. But I'm going to do it anyway because no one has ever accused me of excessive intelligence. And I think that consistent with what my colleagues said, I think that the Republicans are going to take on the order of 53 seats in the Senate and have a very healthy gain in the order of 20 to 25 seats in the House of Representatives. I think as much as 30. The reason I think that, even though the polls don't quite show it, or the models don't quite show it, they show a little bit, they show a sort of smaller Republican victory, is that I think that one of the things we've noticed in U.S. politics, and maybe the politics of inflation reinforce this, is an increasing nationalization of even midterm elections, which means that people are increasingly voting not for the candidate in front of them in the congressional elections, not for the specific senator, but for the party. And that means that when things break one way, they break that way in every race. And when you see the momentum shifting toward the Republicans, it's a good bet that it will be shifting everywhere and in a roughly correlated way. This is an advantage for you if you think about it, if you decide to stay up really late and watch the elections. So I'll give you just a little bit of a pro tip. If you're watching elections in the states like Virginia and New Hampshire will announce early, those are the most interesting races, but they are all very correlated. And so if you see the Republicans do better in Virginia or New Hampshire, you should expect that to be, than they're expected to, you should expect that to carry through into all of the other states. And by contrast, if you see them do worse, you should also expect that to carry through. So I guess I expect a big Republican victory. I think maybe I would differ some from Bruno about what that will mean for U.S. politics, but maybe we can discuss that.
You just make an interesting point, Jeremy. This brings or frame my second question. So first we talk about the bets. Now the reasons why. In every election there are two layers. You have the story of the day. You mentioned inflation. During the summer there are abortion movements. It's less, it's more inflation. But then there are underlying currents. And especially as you just said, even midterm elections are being nationalized. So you don't have only local topics, you have some ground underlying currents. So what is currently, what is the main theme? Is it Latino voters? Is it, East and West Coast still, and the Rust Belt in the middle, flyover states? What's the topic under? Let's start with you. I think you make very good points.
parties, but between their electorates. U.S. politics are becoming increasingly tribal. There's a fascinating study recently about whether you would accept it, or who you would accept that your children would marry. And 30, 50 years ago, that showed a real racial divide. Today, that shows that people don't mind if their children marry somebody from a different race, but they're very upset that they would marry someone from a different party. And so I think that the elections are becoming a little bit tribal, very tribal. There is this sense that, as President Biden has been saying in the past few days, that that democracy is at stake. So it's not just an election about specific policies; it's an election about the future of the republic. And the Republicans are doing the same thing. Donald Trump basically said that the Democrats are destroying America. So I think that means that what we're seeing is increasingly winner-take-all politics, increasing nationalization, increasing polarization, which is obviously a big difficulty for governments.
How about you guys?
Yeah, I agree with much of that. I think if you look into the weeds of what's going on in American politics, I think basically the more I look at the data, the more I'm convinced that this is essentially a story about education polarization. So what do I mean by that? I mean college-educated voters who, remember, are a minority of America and every Western society, but drifting apart from the rest of the country culturally, politically, and economically. Now, if you go back to 2016, the gap between the Republican Donald Trump's advantage among non-college educated white voters and Hillary Clinton's advantage among college educated voters, the gap, the difference was about 30 points. Looking at the polls last night, it's about 33 points. The point I'm making is that actually there is almost no evidence that the Democrats, in my mind at least, there is no evidence that the Democrats have successfully responded to the primary challenge that's facing every left-wing party across the West today, which is how to win back non-college educated, working-class voters from small towns and rural areas. That is being exacerbated by a second key trend in American politics, which we're all going to be talking about for the next week, which is 33% of Latino Hispanic voters voting Republican. That is about double what it was in 2016. Those voters are also working class and typically undergraduate, but they're also culturally conservative. They don't want to defund the police, they don't want to lock down the economy, and they want to talk a lot more about how to get America growing again. They don't want to talk so much about issues like abortion, climate change, and democracy. So, to me, this education story, this divide, the divide that's not only being compounded by geography, but is also now being compounded by generation, by the fact that Generation Z and millennials are more likely to pass through universities, and older generations are less likely to have passed through universities. This is the defining story of our time. It also explains Brexit. It explains why Boris Johnson won over so many working class voters in the Red Wall, and it explains why Marine Le Pen and Giorgia Meloni have been doing so well among many of the same groups. So the challenge, I think, for Democrats after tomorrow, and indeed the challenge after the last decade, is how to stop speaking only to highly educated, high-income graduates. And here's just one stat: they spent $320 million during this midterm campaign on adverts about abortion, and they spent $30 million on adverts about tackling inflation. So the challenge is to talk less to their core base and to start repairing their relationship with the non-graduate working class voters who have been leaving them for not just the last 4 years, but for the last 20 years.
I think my view is so close to Matt's that I'll be brief. So I remember when 20 years ago studying in the US that all the courses I was taking at the time, everyone would tell us that Republicans soon would be unable to win an election because of the demographic changes. It didn't turn out that way, and why not? I think in the end, the Democrats got captured by a certain set of ideas that out to be too removed from the average voter and from working class voters. This contradiction that I talked about, if you're a party on the left, you have to appeal to the working class voters, and Democrats, for reasons that we can discuss, now seem too removed, unreliable in some respects. You see on climate policy, on energy independence, which turned out to be so important in this campaign, it's not so much that Biden had the wrong policies, because he actually didn't, and he was quite moderate on energy policy, but it's the sense that the average voter thinks that Biden is too committed to a certain worldview that doesn't represent him. I guess the turmoil in the Republican Party that 5 years ago everyone was telling us is going to be the end again of the Republican Party, Trump and turmoil created, actually allowed the party to look around and try to appeal to what now may well turn out to be a broader constituency than what the Democrats are talking to.
Well, this moves me further with my question, next question, and is what should be the impact of the result of the election. So, if most of you here assume that the Republicans would win on the Hill, at least in the House, that's almost the rule. Clinton has paid the price in 1994, Trump in 2018, Obama in 2010. So midterm elections are always balancing. So there was only one exception, and it was George W. Bush in 2002, but it was related with the attack on America. So in that perspective, nothing extraordinary, but still many people are asking the question, how this should impact on this or that. If if you go to Central and Eastern Europe, most likely the first question would be, what do you expect as the impact of the support of Ukraine? I came to Brussels today, so if you ask in Brussels, they would mostly ask you what would be the impact of the Green Deal and the climate agenda. If you are coming from Hong Kong or China, I would expect the first question is the impact on the relationship to China and how their autonomy would go. So maybe Jan will have some additional questions to it, but at least the impact on those two, what do you expect on the Ukraine and the climate agenda?
I'll only speak about Ukraine. On Ukraine, it's obvious that the sort of average opinion in the Republican Party is different on Ukraine. If you take an average, it's not isolationism, but it's a sense of America going at it alone, not relying so much on partners, on allies. A sense, obviously, Trump introduced this idea, it's turned out to be quite powerful, the sense that America is permanently being taken advantage of by everyone else, and now the sense that America is being taken advantage of by Ukraine. There's no real commitment to this idea of a global order that the U.S. has to defend. I find that idea personally very stupid. The U.S. gets enormous benefits, even economic, from being a global leader. But again, the dominant view in the Republican Party seems to be that the U.S. is being taken advantage of. So I think I'm worried about that, as someone who's very concerned about Ukraine's fate in the next year. But I also think that by this point, and in great measure due to Biden's choices, the U.S. is so committed to the war that it will be difficult now to abandon Ukraine without it sending to everyone, including to Republicans, as also an American defeat. reassured by that sense that it's too late for the U.S. to ignore Ukraine. I hope I'm right about that. We'll see when the new House Speaker starts speaking publicly about these issues after the election.
We'll mix it up a little bit, I guess. Look, I mean, I think that Bruno describes the Republican Party very well. The only issue is trying to translate that into governance when the Republicans are controlling the Congress, which is a bit of a complicated task, particularly when it comes to foreign policy. The fact of the matter is that the principal implication of the Republicans taking the House will be that the president's domestic agenda, the legislative agenda, will be absolutely dead. There will be nothing going through Congress, basically, except the occasional budget. And the Congress will embark on 100,000 investigations of the president and of his administration for obscure topics that we can't even imagine right now. They will probably impeach him once or twice in revenge for the Democrats having done that to Trump. And that will be what will consume Washington. Foreign policy for that is a bit of an afterthought. The Republican, well, not just the Republican Congress, but any Congress is completely a coward on foreign policy. They really don't want to take strong positions. Sometimes it's a convenient place to hit the president for being incompetent or for making mistakes, but they don't really want to actually take any decisions. So that means that they're not really going to be being seen to take responsibility, for example, for cutting off Ukrainian aid. What they'll do is critique the president for all of the problems that might arise in Ukraine, for spending too much, for not getting enough European support, not getting enough European spending for the taking advantage argument that Bruno talked about. But by and large, they won't really play on foreign policy, and Biden, like Clinton and Obama and Bush before him, will move toward foreign policy when he loses the presidency and look to establish some wins there because he can operate a lot more there without the Congress.
I think it's interesting looking at the potential impact of the midterms as well, not only in terms of Ukraine and foreign policy, also just assessing the internal impact of what we're likely to see. If the red wave is broad and deep, then it is inevitable that the debate next week will begin. We will replace Joe Biden in 2024, and that will be a debate about what kind of party the Democrats want to be. And there will again be a tussle between, I think, the radical progressives within the Democrats and who we might loosely call the moderate centre-left social democrats. And that debate, I think, is an incredibly important one for the Democrats to have and to resolve if they can. And there's no obvious contender for that. We were discussing over dinner last night whether it would be potentially somebody that we aren't even identifying at the moment, somebody at a sort of government level. It might even be a sort of Hillary Clinton gets a little another run. It's impossible at this point to predict where that race will go, other than Kamala Harris definitely won't be the next nominee for the Democrats. But I think the impact will also be quite acute when it comes to the Republicans. I mean, if this is a big moment of victory for the Republicans, that will cement the party's current direction of travel. I think that will cement the more radical tendencies within the Republicans. It will embed Donald Trump's dominance over the Republicans. It will, I think, almost certainly keep them in this national conservatism mold that they've been developing since 2016. And that in turn will have, I think, profound consequences for American democracy. Speaking as a Brit, I hope that whatever happens after the gridlock that Jeremy points to, and I think he's absolutely right, but I hope that we begin to perhaps have somebody in the White House who begins to reach out to Europe a little bit more, that begins to maybe even consider a trade agreement with Brexit, let's see if that comes in the near future. And I hope that we actually can begin to use the next president post 24 to try and redefine our role in the world, actually, bouncing off whoever is at the White House, because at the moment we don't seem to have much of a role outside of Ukraine, which is obviously incredibly important. So I think the impact is going to be multifaceted, and it's going to keep these debates that we've already been having about the direction of social democratic politics and Republican politics right at the very forefront.
Well, we mentioned Hillary versus Trump. That would be a really cool soap opera. Hopefully not, but who knows. But I would stay a bit on the topic that you sort of like have in the middle of every sentence. So how will American U.S. leadership look like short term and in the medium term, because it's changing. So if tomorrow the hill will become red, there will be gridlock, then they will start moving again. So structure-wise, short term, medium term, how will leadership look like? It's going to be direct, indirect, it's going to be from behind. Maybe we see that, for example, on the topic of China, I think the chip sanction is very targeted, in a good way. It's not some mass bombardment, it's pretty smart. So do you think that in future America will lead it like through these targeted actions, or how will leadership look like also towards our part of the world? Maybe Bruno will start. Yeah, take it.
Well, I do think the Chinese leadership is, I think, sometimes think that one of the reasons they've been quite patient. I do think the Chinese leadership has been patient. There's no response to the restrictions, export restrictions on chips yet. The party Congress came and went, and still no response. I think the response to Pelosi's visit to Taiwan was measured and controlled. And I think the reason is that the Chinese leadership has great hopes and expectations for the future of American politics. They expect turmoil, they expect conflict, they expect civil conflict of different kinds, they expect paralysis, they expect to have an election where a number of governors don't recognize the results in their states, and have a constitutional crisis. Now there's, of course, we can debate whether this is too pessimistic, but I think there's a case to be made for it. And if you are America's adversary, I think there's a lot in this election and in what comes after that looks promising, let me put it that way. Not so much, I think, because America will be distracted, or because there will be conflict on fundamental policy, because of China, it doesn't seem to be. But because the situation could, well, get out of control at some point, and could have a serious constitutional crisis. Not now, not in the next 2 years, but we haven't talked enough about 2024. Also with respect to Ukraine, because I believe the war will still be going on. So 2024, this is a war moment, 2024, but 2024 is the real deal in my opinion.
And how about American leadership, Jeremy?
Yeah, I think that Bruno was right to focus on 2024 for that. The nature of U.S. governance is that the president makes foreign policy fundamentally. He determines the nature of U.S. leadership. The Biden administration has been a very traditional, particularly since the Ukraine war started, a very traditional administration when it comes to U.S. leadership, particularly in Europe. There were some signs in their first year that maybe they wouldn't be, but they have returned to that. Arguably, from a perspective of Europeans, they have been too traditional because they are maybe creating a sort of false sense that the United States isn't evolving away from that, when in my perspective it is. But in any case, I think that interregnum will continue at least to 2024. Joe Biden is who Joe Biden is, and he is too old to change. I'm a lot younger than him, and I'm already too old to change. So I think he's going to continue fundamentally the types of policies, and particularly when it comes to Ukraine, he's going to continue the American leadership on that issue, which has been quite decisive and really the central feature of organizing the Western response. I think Ivan Krasnov, my colleague from ECFR, had a piece in the New York Times today where he essentially said that the unity over Ukraine can only break in the United States because it is the United States that has been holding European unity together, and it's the only thing that can break it apart. And that brings us, I think, to 2024, because I think Bruno was really right that a different president could have a very different perspective on that. And in this case, it's not even primarily maybe about the Republicans. It's a little bit hard to tell where a lot of Republicans are, but it is certainly about Donald Trump, who looks to be the candidate. He basically said he's going to run yesterday. He's certainly a shoo-in for the Republican nomination if he does run. And if he becomes president, which is not so certain, but certainly a possibility, he has a very unique approach, unique even within the Republican Party, to Russia, one that no one has ever really been able to explain. Well, some people have explained it, but usually somewhat conspiratorially. But in any case, it's been quite consistent, and I think that, he really hates two things: Democrats and Ukrainians. And so I think that in 2024 there could be radical shifts in that policy, less if the Republicans win than if Donald Trump wins.
Yeah, I changed my mind on Trump and Ukraine because, on the one hand, we've obviously seen him being very against intervention and viewing some of these conflicts in the past as being essentially none of America's business. But we also know Trump the narcissist, and we know Trump the grandstander, the guy who would like to go toe-to-toe with another leader. And so I'm less certain that we may see a fundamental shift in stance towards Ukraine. I also wonder openly whether Trump too looks different in the sense that he'll be more experienced, you would think. He may have a different team, you might hope. People who perhaps are maybe more competent, perhaps. And our guiding assumption is that Trump 2 looks a lot like Trump 1, but actually, in some respects, it may be quite different. And of course, the environment in 2024, the wider economic environment, may also look radically different from how it looks today. And the inflation, energy crisis, the low growth rates, that if you look at most of the estimates for the next 5 years, that we're going to have, the continuing challenges within China's economy, the uncertainty over the direction of China with zero COVID, and sort of, weakening economy generally. I wonder what sort of challenges all of that is going to throw up to both the Democrats and the Republicans in 2024. But also, just lastly, I wanted to echo Bruno's point. I'm deeply concerned about the escalation of political violence in America. And I don't think it's implausible anymore to speculate about the prospects of some kind of civil war within America. I think I remember having this conversation with Jonathan Haidt, who's you will know, who's a social psychologist a few years ago. And Jonathan then was making the point that within his lifetime, the idea of a state leaving the United States was no longer implausible. But you could see a scenario whereby the Democrats are locked out of power for a long period of time. Because the system is working against the Democrats, don't forget. The Democrats from here on need to be getting 52, 53, 54% of the popular vote in order to hold the institution of power, because the geography of American politics is now working against the Democrats, especially in the Senate. So the idea of a prolonged Republican rule within America is not implausible. And how the Democrats Democrats respond to that? Will northern, affluent, prosperous, liberal states begin to entertain the thought that maybe actually this United States is not working out for them over the longer term? Germany would be a better place than I to speculate on this, but I certainly think within my lifetime, the Republic itself doesn't feel particularly secure and stable. If we've learned anything from Trump 1 in terms of how Democrats respond to Trump politics, it's that they become a lot more radical. I mean, if you look at all of the data, Pew Research Center, Zach Goldberg's research, what you've seen post-2016 is a radicalization among white graduate liberals who have become much more liberal in response to Trump 1. So how do they respond to Trump 2? And I think that's an open question. I don't know what the answer to that is, but I imagine that would have some profound internal consequences for American politics.
Yes, profound. Although I would say if you wanted to start a civil war, I wouldn't start with graduate millennials. I think that even though I agree with you about the political dynamics, I think the issue there is that in the United States, particularly the coercive power of the state is such that there isn't really going to, you can have little bits of political violence, you can have a lot of protests, I think you will, but you actually can't really have a civil war because the minute you start it is the day you lose it. And so that's both good and bad. I think it's good that you don't end up with a massive civil war. It's bad that there isn't really going to be, if the Democrats are locked out of politics to a degree, as you said, the avenue of protest won't be very politically effective. And I think that's, and that the Republicans, or the state generally, has an incredible number of options for cracking down on that they're going to be quite willing to use. So I think you can see something very fundamental changing in the nature of American governance, but that is a state-led revolution, not a societally-led revolution. In terms of Trump 1 versus Trump 2, I mean, I agree with you very much that it's going to be quite different, in part because not so much that Donald Trump has precisely learned, but rather that he has at least figured out how to gather around himself people who are both loyal and competent, which was something that he had a lot of difficulty finding in his first term, and was just getting into place as the second term, as the first term ended. And you can see, actually, it was a sort of interesting natural experiment there. When his first term ended, after the election, he told his government, well, I won the election, so prepare the second term. So they started. And they did something that a lot of second-term administrations do, which is that they immediately put loyalists into the commanding heights of the agencies that they wanted to control. They, particularly the intelligence community and the Defense Department. And they started to implement a civil service reform, which would allow them, in their views, to sort of rid the government of the deep state. And I think that what you would see in a second term is, in the first instance, a war on the permanent government, a war on the bureaucracy, a war on the deep state, which the president would probably win. And secondly, you see Trump having a greater ability to actually get what he wants. And that really gets me back to the Russia point, because in Trump 1, Trump really went very much, was very pro-Russian, but he didn't really have a pro-Russian policy, because he didn't have a government that was willing to implement one, or capable of implementing one. In the second term, I think he will manage to have that kind of thing. And so the difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2 is that we will get actual Trump instead of one filtered through what they used to call the adults in the room.
Well, in fact, the medias open an interesting theme of the changing democracy in demography crusader on one hand. On the other hand, could inevitably lead also to less wokeism, and it's on the left. So that's observation from Prague. Maybe it's not so much inside, but if you would be asked to respond, how much this changing demography is going to influence the mainstream of both Republican and Democratic parties, and how they would have to react, to this kind of a challenge. So, what first got on mind?
Let me talk a little bit about that, but also about responding to Jeremy. What could go wrong in a second? What would a Trump term look like, and what could go wrong? Pretty much everything. But you still sounded relatively sanguine about it. So on the demographic question, race relations, I think things could go very wrong. Trump showed during the first term that he has. I don't think he has any particularly malevolent view of race relations. We may disagree on that. I think there are worse people in the Republican Party. But he certainly has no sensibility whatsoever, and he has no temperament to deal with difficult race relations. So I could see that getting out of control. The wrong kind of statements, the wrong kind of policies that people around Trump will impose. And that's certainly a problem. Demographics, the anxiety about the demographic change will obviously lead to a different kind of policy on the border and the border wall. I have to say, I'm kind of puzzled how the U.S. Still has not implemented a real border policy. Why that turns out to be so difficult. But I suspect that's one of the reasons Trump might still win. People are getting exasperated. And he will implement it. This time around, he will have the people, and he will have the civil servants to implement it. That also could turn out very bad with a repressive policy, a militarized policy on the border. What could also turn out very badly is if the state apparatus in the U.S. starts to be used for what will in fact be, but will nonetheless be perceived as a witch hunt against Trump's allies. A series of investigations that everyone, starting with the New York Times, will have no doubts are politically motivated, and many of them might be politically motivated. So I think that more than riots or protests, these kind of systems could have developed, and that Trump will be motivated by the responses to press harder. What could also go wrong is, of course, China and Taiwan. People around Trump are imprudent, in some cases inexperienced. China is also a different China to the party Congress. So we could have a repressive witch hunt against opponents. We could have a war in Taiwan. We could have what will look like a far-right border policy. And we could have a racial tinderbox exploding with a repetition of the Floyd protests / riots. That's an American debate. It's still a discussion about how to characterize those. So I think it might not happen, but that's we don't really know what Trump stands for anymore. His typical ideas were already part of his first term. I think he will just this time around try to get something more tangible out of them. He lost the fears and a certain inability that he had in the first term. And finally, of course, hearing where there's also some risks that Trump will tell us after 2024 that he gave NATO a chance in his first term, but that there's been no change. Look at the budget in Germany. And so this time around, I'm serious.
Just one comment on the back of that. One person we've not mentioned this evening, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, and I think one of the interesting results to watch over the next 24 hours or so will be the result in Florida, because obviously DeSantis is going to have to make a decision about whether or not he is going to position himself over the next few months as a contender to Trump, or whether he has looked at the same primary polls and has concluded that because he's still 20 odd points behind Trump, that actually his best bet is either to wait this one out or to try and position himself to be a VP on the Trump ticket. The reason I say that is because of what both Jeremy and Bruno mentioned, which is that we know Trump's grasp of policy is loose and unpredictable, but we know that DeSantis has a much stronger grasp of policy and is much more determined, I would argue, to see through what he believes within the realm of policy. If you look at what he's done, for example, in Florida around Disney, corporations, COVID, all of that stuff. In many respects, if you were on the Republican end of American politics, you may have a good case to argue that DeSantis is the far more interesting of the two. Is a much more interesting candidate relative to Donald Trump. And also, how does Trump manage DeSantis? That's another question that I think is going to hang over American politics between now and securing the nomination. How does Trump handle the fact that there is somebody who is younger, smarter, a much more sophisticated user of policy and media in many respects than Trump, maybe not media, but certainly policy. And I think that internal tussle within the Republican Party is also going to be a very interesting one to watch, because they too are having a philosophical debate of sorts, which the British Tories are having, but they're having it in a very different way, which is, what does conservatism mean in 2022? What is conservative politics? Is it this national conservatism that Trump and Rubio and Hawley and DeSantis are trying to carve out? Is it a sort of Boris Johnsonian, boosterism, cakeism, mess of a conservatism that's fallen so flat in British politics? And I think this debate within the centre-right is also global. And again, I think we need to caution against viewing this as chiefly an American discussion, because whoever answers this question, how can conservatism reinvent itself to hold together this new electorate that it's got? And I think that's also relevant, by the way, for the Czech Republic, looking at some of the debates that you're having within your politics. Whoever answers that riddle is going to find a lot of success.
I think that's really smart. It does make sense to look a lot at Ron DeSantis. I have no idea whether he'll be the vice presidential candidate or anything like that. I'm not prepared yet to talk about Republican VP picks for 2024, but I think it absolutely bears watching it exactly that way. I'm glad you made me see it that way. I wanted to maybe touch a little bit on this demography question which you asked, which I think people have been careful to avoid because it's kind of hard. But I'm willing to say something dumb about it. I think that to sort of return to the point that Matt made about the growing Hispanic vote and the movement of that vote, still, about 2/3 of Democratic vote, but still that's a lot more than it used to be, a lot less than it used to be. This is, to me, the most interesting demographic group. It's the fastest growing demographic group. And it's really finding a sort of political awakening. It is a very diverse group, and it's really hard to characterize. But I think that, as Matt indicated, one of the reasons that the Democrats are losing it is that they haven't had a sufficiently cultural approach, I think. The reach that they tried to make to Hispanics, but also to the non-graduates and the lower middle classes, generally speaking, has been the sort of traditional social democratic one of, we have the economic policies that benefit the make policies to a much greater extent than the Republicans do. But they also have, and they've had a lot of talk since Trump won in 2016 of reaching out to those people and talking their language, just the way that Matt recommended they do. But they haven't done it because they keep coming to them with healthcare policies and economic policies and tax credits and stuff like that, which are nice. But what they haven't done is recognize that a cultural gap is opening up between these graduates that Matt referred to, who have a real, I mean, it's a pejorative term, but they have a sort of woke appreciation of the world. And this is something that is particularly annoying, I think, in the Hispanic community. There's a fascinating thing going on in language in the United States right now, where the sort of right-thinking cultural elites of the East Coast have determined that you have to call Latinas Latinx. When they do surveys, Latinx people don't actually want to be called this. And there is this entire sort of cultural edifice which is being erected, which is very annoying to those types of social groups. And I think that the Democrats and more generally the cultural elite haven't even really heard or recognized this critique. And when you interact that with the demography of growing Hispanic and other working class populations, I think you do have a problem for the Democrats in the long term. And I agree, I think Bruno had said that this idea that simply the sort of browning of the electorate, which is definitely happening, would benefit, would ipso facto benefit the Democrats, is already proving not to be true.
US is not the only country with strong demographic changes and shifts. China is being killed by demography, literally while we speak. Today there is 1.4 billion Chinese in the world, it's the most populous country. Next year, India will become #1. And China is dying. In 2050, there will be less than 1 billion Chinese. In beginning of 22nd century, it's going to be somewhere between 600 to 700 million, which will have a massive impact on labor market, economy, health, etc. So from the long-term perspective, we can say that the US will be the West will be the winner, but there is plenty of time between now and the 22nd century. And of course, massive changes can create a lot of problems and volatility, because then when you are insecure, you can make wrong bets and moves. So basically, if we move now a little bit from Atlantic to Indo-Pacific, as we now say, so how you see this grand rivalry, and when we look into new national security strategy that was released, I think, 3 weeks ago, China is mentioned there, I don't know, 80 times, something like that. So it's on literally every page. So maybe let's start this future. I mean, how you see as American strategists working with current NSC advisor to Vice President, how you see this rivalry in upcoming years to come?
Well, I don't know those numbers. It's quite fascinating. I think that there is an element of consensus on this topic. I think Bruno already mentioned it across Washington, that China is the overwhelming threat, a greater problem than the United States has ever faced before, and that U.S. policy U.S. foreign policy needs to reorient itself toward the Asia Pacific. This is actually a consensus that goes back to the Obama administration. The Trump administration shared it, although they often use different means and mechanisms to achieve it. And certainly the Biden administration shares it, and that's very clearly reflected in the national security strategy. I think the issue they have is that if you read the national security strategy, it says all of those things. If you, and a White House official mentioned this to me recently, if you go to a White House meeting, 80% of them are on Russia and Ukraine. And so they're having a lot of trouble operationalizing, going back to 2014 or something, operationalizing the idea that China needs to be their #1 priority. Bruno mentioned the possibility under Trump too of a China and Taiwan war. It's actually a fairly strong consensus in Washington that there will be a China and Taiwan war, regardless of who is next U.S. president. Most of the officials in Washington see something like that happening by the end of the decade. So I think that this is an enormous focus. It really has seized the strategists in Washington, but the world keeps intervening, and I'm not really sure when they're ever going to get to the China problem. It'll probably take an actual war to do that.
Well, I think you're right to stress the importance of demography. I've spent a lot of my career looking at tribes and populism, and why people are voting for Maloney and Le Pen, Trump and so on. And it's quite clear that demography is at the heart of that, or at least a fear, actually perceived, that one's group is losing influence and status and resources relative to other groups in society. And I don't think that demography problem, by the way, is unique to China. I think if you look at the UK or Italy or Bulgaria or much of southern and eastern Europe, that problem is also very, very present. And so we're either going to have to find governments that are going to, and this again to echo Jeremy's point, this is where it gets a bit sensitive, but we're either going to have Western governments that will start to develop and promote pro-natal policies, which we see in some European countries. It's interesting now that Britain is, for the first time, beginning to actually tiptoe around a conversation about what that would entail, what kind of tax policies would that entail, what kind of incentives would that entail. We're either going to have a more mature, serious conversation about that, or, put simply, we're going to have a lot more inward migration over the longer term as we deal with rapidly aging societies. And you mentioned that, in some respects, the big winner will be Europe. I would push back a little bit on that. I think the big winner will be Africa. I think the big winner is going to be North African states, where populations, over the longer term, will eventually plateau, and we're beginning to see that. But in the short term, the winners will be the likes of Nigeria and elsewhere. When already in the UK, for example, the group that is growing most rapidly are Nigerians and Indians, by the way. Czechs, Lithuanians, Latvians, Poles, no longer coming to the UK. Zimbabweans, Nigerians, Indians are now among the largest groups, and Albanians, but that's a different story. So I think overall we're going to see some profound shifts into demography, and will probably end up taking us into these debates that are highly sensitive, but in my view, I think quite necessary if we're going to meet that challenge. But I would defer on China to Bruno, as I always do.
Before I will give a floor to Bruno on China, and as you said, Matthew, he's not expert, so just sort of like reading recommendations. So if there is in today's Western world somebody who understands profoundly these demographic shifts, it's actually a former US Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, who is now writing a lot of papers and he's been writing them for a while, also on China. So how these long-term shifts change not only the economy but long-term policies.
If I could suggest another person, my fellow Brit, Paul Morland, has written some fantastic work on the 200 to 500 year demographic shifts that we are going to see. His book, The Human Tide, is also really worth reading. And in the UK, he's been one of the only thinkers who's actually said we need to now start to develop pro-natal policies, and has gone out on a limb to actually detail what sorts of policies would incentivize couples to have more children and also married couples to stay together over longer term. Where, of course, the UK now has one of the highest rates of family breakdown in the Western world.
So now to Bruno with a sentence from or quote from last Chinese Communist Party Congress, where President Xi was saying that every good communist shall have 3 children.
The question of will China overtake the U.S. or will China at the very least be able to challenge the U.S. and have a kind of divided power over global politics and global economy? I'm not sure that anything happened in the last 2, 3, 4 years that should force us to reassess. The mood is certainly different. 4 years ago, people were much more pessimistic on the U.S. And to Biden's credit, I think he has changed the mood. He has showed that the U.S. can work with allies against China. He has shown that the U.S. can have something like an industrial policy, maybe not fully developed, but at least a beginning. It has shown that the U.S. can design smart surgical policies against China. I think the latest set of export restrictions shows this. But, you know, in the end, I still think that the U.S.'s strengths that it has shown in the past 2, 3 years, they are legacy strengths. They don't really point to the future. There's nothing that the U.S. is doing that could be described as shaping the future world. Of course, in terms of legacy power, the U.S. is far ahead. And you can use the control you have over certain chokeholds in the semiconductor supply chain in order to hit China. I'm not convinced for a moment that China will be unable to develop a semiconductor industry afterwards. It will slow it down a bit, but I think Americans are deeply deceived if they think that Chinese society is unable to innovate. That's not what I see in China, what I've always seen in China. On demography, I was quite surprised the other day giving a lecture in Hamburg and explaining to the audience that I thought it was inevitable that China's total GDP would overtake American GDP simply because of the difference in population. And then you would have to have a much lower GDP per capita for the US to remain #1. And that has its importance for the defense budget and other areas. And the Georgetown economist in the audience stood up and said, she was young, and she said, in my lifetime, I can bet with you that the US and China will converge on population numbers. Essentially the same population. By 2070, they both will have around 500 million. And then, you know, I asked her for a little more support, a little more evidence for that. She sent it to me. I'm not entirely convinced. But, you know, that will change things. The moment it does matter. Then you could actually talk about a world where the US would remain the largest economy in the world for the foreseeable future. Or perhaps India would become the largest economy in the world, which is also a possibility if we're talking about 2070. But, you know, I think this is, the structural forces are in place. And the two main structural forces are, I think, China's ability to develop new technologies. I don't doubt that. And second, the US's difficulty in mobilizing the public and the collective in American politics for collective goals. I still don't see the US ability to do that. It was unable to do it during COVID, and I don't think Biden's industrial policy really constitutes a significant exception to that paralysis. I think that will be the big if the US is competing with China over the 50 years that we're talking about.
In the past, what has been written about the influence of the price of oil and petrol in the US politics, and we just noticed that a couple of weeks ago, Joe Biden called to Saudi Arabia to expand drilling to bring the price down, and then we listened to shocking response by Riyadh to squeeze the drilling for export to bring the price up. So the question is this, you know, because I'm not used to that from the US exception during the Yom Kippur War, but it was a large context. But in the past, so what does it mean? It's just, a variant that Joe Biden somehow mishandled the communication with Saudi Arabia, or this variant of this famous Trump's quotation that if I am in the White House, it would never happen. Or is this a sign of something, of a deeper problem, structural problem of the international relationship? Because we are all, looking for bringing the price down. Even in Europe, it's makes a different point.
Yeah, a friend of mine said to me, we have so many discussions about politics and what's moving the election and all the different polls and everything. At the end of the day, it turns out that the only thing that matters is the price of gasoline. And you can perfectly predict the election from the price of gasoline, which is really true. And you can see the Biden administration operating under that hypothesis. Their entire policy for the last 6 months has been aimed at getting the price of gasoline down by today. They had a moderate success in that. 6 months ago, the price of gasoline was about $5 a gallon. In the US today, it's about $3.80. And if I can tell you that if the price of gasoline was $5 today, I would have predicted a much worse outcome for the election today. So $3.80 is what gets them to where they are. So I think that's a sort of strange reality of U.S. politics. There's just some really interesting sort of social psychological studies about why that is, but I think we need to go into that. In terms of the U.S. Saudi Arabia, I do think that is a sort of indication of a couple of structural changes that are going on. The first is that there has been this sort of recognition in the U.S. That was something from Obama and Trump and now continuing that, that as I said, that they needed to sort of husband resources and that they needed to be less involved and less decisive in the Middle East and in Europe. And you've seen a bit of a retrenchment from the Middle East, particularly under Biden, but also under Trump. And that has had an effect on regional dynamics there, which has meant that a lot of countries that used to be a little bit more obedient to the U.S. system have been striking out a bit on their own. You see this with Turkey, you see this with Saudi Arabia, you see this with a lot of countries around the world, where they're not enemies of the United States, but they're no longer vassals, and they've gotten into a sort of gray area where they're anxious to express their independence. For Saudi Arabia, actually, in the first instance, the Khashoggi incident really alienated them from the United States, or really alienated the United States from them. But in the second instance, it's not really talked about a lot, but Trump's failure to respond to the Iranian attack on Aramco, and that was in 2019, was quite shocking to the Saudi elite and really made them recognize that they needed to have stronger relationships with Russia and with China, and they needed to balance. And I think you're seeing the fruits of that, for better and for worse. This is very upsetting to the Biden administration. It's even generally upsetting to the American body politic. I have to say, I'm a bit sanguine about it. I'm not really sure we were ever going to control the Saudis. And I think I prefer not to be in bed with them. But that means that presents a certain challenge for the United States to be as geopolitically promiscuous as the Saudis are and as the Turks are. And I think that's proven to be something that is at least not in the habit of U.S. diplomats and U.S. foreign policymakers, but it's something that they will probably need to move to in this new sort of more multipolar world.
Just a quick comment on this, because I world, which suddenly looks much strengthened. But what's happening in Ukraine is that Ukraine's interests, Europe's interests, and America's interests are so perfectly aligned that they all want Russia to come out weaker. There's a little difference whether all of them want Russia to be defeated. Ukraine certainly does, the others are not always sure, but they certainly want Russia not to win. But when the interests are not perfectly aligned, when leadership and power and leverage and influence are necessary to draw attitudes and behavior from other countries, I think we see a much more multipolar world. That has been true in the case of Turkey, more or less spectacularly. It's been true with UAE and Saudi Arabia. It's been obviously true with India. There was always problems in the U.S. India relationship, but what is kind of interesting this time around is that the U.S. is not even trying to exert influence over India on any question. It may well be because it doesn't need to, but there's also a recognition that it wouldn't be able to. And it's also the case with South Korea on many questions. We'll see now on the chips whether the U.S. is able to bring the Netherlands and Japan on board. I have many doubts. See Netherlands and Japan salivating at the possibility of controlling the Chinese market alone and not having the Americans there. So I think it is a different world. In the Ukraine war, we might give the false impression for a while that we're back in 1993.
From this perspective, I think we can conclude this part that Bill Clinton probably was right, and at the end it's all about technology.
Stupid.
And that's true. And nevertheless, we are coming to finale, but still we have a few minutes. So if anyone from our audience would like to shout a question either to all three speakers or targeted, we have a mic. Don't hesitate to ask. Jan, Monza, there also, so just shout a question. So first row and then start.
Okay, first of all, thank you all for your debate. And you all talked about radicalization in U.S. politics. And do you think there is something that can cool it down a bit or to de-escalate? Or do we have to reach a certain point where we see the American politics becoming some bizarre sort of social media reality show where folks are finding Q&As before it eventually comes back to normal? Or do you think that radicalization can help to, put more cooperation between the actual center right and the center left, because they eventually find out that they have more in common with themselves on the opposite of the center point of the axis than with radicals from both their own group, not mentioning the other group?
Okay, thank you. I was told that the questions would be easier. But that's a very good question. The trends toward, I would say polarization rather than radicalization, but okay, are very strong. I don't see any counter trend that can interrupt them existing in politics right now. I don't think it's possible, given the structure of U.S. politics, for a sort of center-right, center-left coalition to emerge. There's been many, many efforts at that in the last 100 years or so. None of them have succeeded. And I think that adheres deeply in the structure of the U.S. Political institutions. I think that the only thing that can arrest the polarization is a major failure or crisis. So a big war time would be helpful. One or the other parties experiencing a massive failure could do it, but that's the kind of sort of unpredictable thing that I suppose will have to happen eventually, but I don't see it. I can't predict it. I think in terms of the the existing trends, there's nothing to interrupt the polarization.
It's often said that Britain is becoming America, and that we are the same road as America, becoming obsessed with cultural wars and remainders and leaders. The question about marriage, by the way, was recently asked in Britain, and we found that 11% of Brexit voters would feel uncomfortable if their son or daughter married a Remainer. 37% of Remainers would feel uncomfortable if their son or daughter married a Brexit voter, which I actually think says more than the poll realises it's saying. Anyway, we can come back to that at another time. The point about polarisation, you know, I'm struck, I've been thinking a lot about the last 3 months in British politics, and just, you know, how did we get to this ridiculous place where Britain has become Italy, or as the Economist said recently, Britain. And I've just come to the conclusion that, you know, actually there's a silver lining to it, which is it's given me confidence that we're not America. Because in America you wouldn't have the extreme levels of volatility that you have in Britain. You would never have voters joining and abandoning parties to that extent. You would never have the fluctuations in the polls that we've had, where Boris Johnson gets 45%, and 2.5 years later he's on 20%, the Conservative Party is on 20%. It just wouldn't happen. It's a 50-50 society. And so I've taken a bit of confidence. Now, you know, what could potentially unlock that polarisation in America? Well, if you look at Gordon Allport's work on prejudice in the 1950s, he argued that essentially you need people to work together towards a common endeavour. You need them to be pursuing shared goals in an environment of trust. And more than anything, you need them to be contacting one another and interacting with one another. And I actually think that America's had the first stuff. It's had COVID, it's had a pandemic, it's had a financial crisis, you know, it's had the big kind of existential sense of doom. But I think what it's not had, and I think the evidence backs me up on this, it's not had the interaction, because the graduate liberals are increasingly in the cities, and online are tending to be in the sort of echo chambers, and the Republicans and the non-grads and so forth are elsewhere in the country. And I don't know, I start thinking about radical policy options. Maybe what we need is some kind of forced integration policy at the school level. Like that, you know, I mean, if you look at South Africa, stuff like that. I mean, seriously, I mean, maybe actually what America needs is some forced integration. Maybe that's one way forward. Look at what the Danes have done. Right? I mean, when yeah, sure. when neighbourhoods became too segregated in Denmark, they forced everybody to move, and they had an interesting ruling that at local level schools, no more than 30% of the classroom of the kids in the classroom could come from one particular group. So they had forced interaction. Maybe what we need is forced political interaction. Just throwing it out there.
Final question?
So,
it's an easy one, they want easy one.
Yeah, I'll give you a pretty easy question. It's a question that Mr. Wondra asked about the impact of Republican or Trump getting to power when it comes to climate change. Because COP27 is happening right now, which is also a very important event. And I'd just like you to provide your thoughts on that.
Sure. Look, the president didn't have much of a climate agenda that he could get through Congress already. He has done a fair amount on climate, but he's mostly done it through various types of executive action. He had some sort of green tech subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act. But of course, they had to sort of push that through Congress. Congress through a party line vote. They won't be able to do that anymore. So from a legislative, and it's worth understanding that climate, from a foreign policy perspective, is the single biggest divide between the Democrats and the Republicans. The Republicans they're not quite climate deniers anymore, but they certainly deny that they should do anything about it. There's not going to be any sort of climate legislation, and they will critique everything that President Biden does on that, and I think it will really slow it down. You can already see that, of course, the American approach to the climate problem is quite different than the European approach. It's based not really on limitations. It's based on technology and on subsidies. I think that was already the most that Biden could do. I don't think that the COP negotiations are really the center of where climate policy is being determined. So it's very difficult to be optimistic about it in the US. I think it's strange a little bit because I think the Democratic Party, the Biden administration, is quite convinced that this is a genuine crisis and that a lot needs to be done about it. But they've barely been able to do anything with the Democratic Congress, and the Republican Congress, I think they're going to be completely stalled.
I would defer to Jeremy on this. I'm not an expert, but I was struck over the last week looking at my own government's response to that particular issue, with both Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak being at the COP conference. So we found ourselves in a remarkable position of Boris Johnson saying that we should not be paying developing countries reparations for damage to the climate that was caused by the Industrial Revolution. Rishi Sunak suggesting that we should be paying reparations to developing countries for the damage caused by the Industrial Revolution. So the issue is certainly a live one also in Britain, not a particularly popular one I might add in working class areas of the Red Wall, where support for removing environmental levies on energy bills runs at about 65%. So I think the politics of net zero, both in the US and the UK, are probably going to get more fraught as we go forward.
And that was the last announcement. So, big thanks to Bruno Machado, Matt Green, Jeremy Shapiro, Alexander Mondra. If you don't have enough of America, United States today, so this evening, also gentlemen, will be interviewed by Michal and his show, 360 at CNN Prima TV, and it's going to be followed by an interview with Sasha Michal and Martin Weiss-Reichelt, so it's going to be real American night, so you can watch it on your telly. And now we will have a drink. Okay, so now we need to present the book. Book will have a drink, so I will just ask Sasha and Bruno to christen the book. The book is then back there. Michal told me that I should tell everyone to buy it because it's subsidized price. I don't know how much, whatever. The book is great. Thanks to publishers, thanks to sponsors, which is PPF, and hopefully it's not the last book. And yeah, base because the base for it.
Dobrý večer, jak se máte? Dobře.
So, just shortly, if I would corroborate on the anecdote that Matthew used when the sausages say that it's not an anecdote for the Czech Republic or Great Britain, we have it here as well. So, we need to form legislation, and if I would do the the analogy of this book and the sausages, I would compare it to an artisanal sausage, where if you see the process of its making, you would even just crave it more. It's very good, perfect cooperation with Bruno, with John from the PPF, with Barclay, who's somewhere around here. He's the translator of the book. And I wish to all of you who want to look and read it, a pleasant reading experience. Thank you so much. And that was time for
So hopefully it's not the last sausage. Yeah, Michal is already grown up to publish the new one recently.
Jo.
Má se to tak, že se